The science of the near-death experience and the science of the spirituality clearly indicates that these types of experiences are real.
Mhm.
Um, Neuroscience 101 today is that we don't perceive this reality, we create it.
Mhm.
We create it. So, what is the experience we're having now? We have biological sensors, eyes, ears, etc., that sample the electromagnetic field that we are all embedded in. And it is a timeless, spaceless electromagnetic field.
Welcome to Soul Explorers with your hosts, Gary Langley and Sally Taylor. Welcome to Soul Explorers. Today we have a really special show for you. We have Dr. Melvin Morse. And Dr. Morse, I believe, was a skeptic when he stumbled on the near-death experience and began
That's
to
correct.
began to write some books, Closer to the Light, Transformed by the Light. Both of those were New York Times bestsellers. I believe I read them in the early 90s. He has several more books, Where God Lives, also a new book that's on a grant study that he recently did, and we'll talk about that during the interview. But Dr. Morse, welcome to Soul Explorers.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to talk to both of you.
Oh, we're really excited to have you here as well. And when I last was in front of you in a Zoom room setting, I was so enthralled with everything that you were saying. So if you don't mind, tell us a little bit about how a medical doctor becomes a researcher of the near-death experience and kind of where that led you.
Gary, I wasn't really a skeptic. Um, I really just didn't know anything about it.
Hmm.
I really, I trained at Johns Hopkins. They don't teach about near-death experiences there. Um, you know, the neurology that I learned was when you're dead, you're dead. That's what the neurologist taught me, and I never questioned that. I never thought anything different. I did get an early heads up from the great Vernon Mountcastle, and he is a neurosurgeon at Hopkins, and he would do such things as remove half of somebody's brain and to treat intractable seizures. So as a medical student, I had the opportunity to work with, I mean, that was our job to do all the scut work on his patients. And one of his patients was 13 years old. He removed half of the brain to treat seizures, and the patient was unaffected by it. He walked with maybe a slight limp, but otherwise, he still had his memories, his personality, his sense of humor. Really, he was unaffected by it. And so I saw Dr. Montcastle on rounds, and I said, "Hey, Dr. Montcastle, what gives? I mean, this is not the neurology that I was taught." And he looked at me and he said, "What the F do neurologists know?" And that's what, that really started me on my explorations in this area. I did stumble on it though. I trained at Seattle Children's Hospital, and I worked for Airlift Northwest. We transported children from Alaska, Montana, Idaho to either Salt Lake City or to Seattle Children's Hospital. And we picked up a young girl named Crystal Merzlock. She's 7 years old in Pocatello, Idaho. And she had drowned in a community swimming pool. She was underwater, documented for over 20 minutes. But as the intensive care medicine world, we say, if you're not warm and dead, you're not dead. So she got warmed up and had a very difficult resuscitation. It was at the point I brought her parents in, and I said, we're going to transport her down to Primary Children's Hospital. But I don't think that she's going to make it, and I think you guys should say goodbye. You know, and they were very religious, so they prayed over her and such as that. But she did live. She did survive. And I happened to see her in follow up. I was working in Pocatello, just working in a local community clinic. And I happened to see her. And I said, "Hey, Crystal, I know you don't remember me, but I sure remember you because, we spent many hours resuscitating you." She looks up at her mom and she says, "Oh, no, I know him. He stuck a tube in my nose." And she then went on to describe in great detail her own resuscitation. Even uh, I called Seattle Children's to when I was sort of stuck, didn't know what to do. She said, "I heard you telling the other doctors, what should I do now?" Chance comments that the nurses made. And then she said she crawled up a tunnel that was lined with bricks to heaven. And she met a woman up there named Elizabeth. And Elizabeth said, "I will help you." And, I was like, come on, what's this about? And she saw the look on my face and she pats me on the wrist and she says, "You'll see, Dr. Morse, heaven is fun." So I was immediately intrigued by this. Her parents were deeply religious Mormons. Uh, they don't have a dogma of crawling up a brick-lined tunnel to heaven. There was no Elizabeth in her life. There was no, grandmother named Elizabeth. There's no Saint Elizabeth. There's no explanation for why this woman came to her named Elizabeth. But at that time, it was these oddities. Because I think from a common sense point of view, we think about it, so what's this all about? Well, a deeply religious young child that survives a near fatal experience is going to think she went to heaven. But the heaven that she described was nothing like the heaven that she was taught. So this intrigued me, and I went back to Seattle Children's Hospital, and we studied over a 15-year period every survivor of cardiac arrest at Seattle Children's Hospital. We discovered to our great surprise that 24 out of 26 of them had these experiences. And Gary, one reason I want to be on your show is because you can read about these things, and I know doctors are, and I see all the Facebook arguments and back and forth. But Gary, I resuscitated a young man in the lobby of Seattle Children's Hospital whose pacemaker failed. And after we resuscitated him, he looked up at me and said, "You guys just sucked me back into my body. That was weird." So, I personally have seen this stuff. And many of the children that we interviewed had never even told anybody of their experience. So these experiences are odd. They don't fit with our usual ideas of what spirituality should be like, and you know, only good people go to heaven. You know, bad people go to hell, or such as that. But the science tells us differently. The science of the near-death experience tells us that we will all have this experience when we die. Nazi prison guards explain this experience. But furthermore, at least for me, when I studied the science of it, I realized that there's a level of this reality that we are not using to our greatest advantage. And I'll explain, since it's Christmas, I'm going to tell you a Christmas story. I was also in private practice while I worked at Seattle Children's in the intensive care unit. And I had a young girl. Her name was Taryn Headland. Several Unsolved Mysteries episodes have been made of her case. She was born with a genetic disease called Wolman's disease. It's invariably fatal. So after she was born, she came to my private practice. And over the next few months, we saw her dwindle away. She was 9 pounds at birth, getting down to 6 pounds. And we did a number of tests on her. But finally, her liver was studied by electron microscopy at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. And they are not going to make a mistake about a diagnosis like this. And so it was Christmas Eve that the results came back to me. And I was like, wow, am I going to tell them on Christmas Eve that their child has a fatal disease? And the parents really they were in total denial. Mrs. Headland thought that the whole problem was that she couldn't figure out what was the right formula for her baby. I mean, she's a very sophisticated woman, but I'm just saying she's in total denial. Obviously, why not? Um, so I just didn't think it was my place to make this kind of decision. I just thought, if it was me, I'd want to know. So we were working a half day in the office before Christmas. I called the Headlands in and I told them the diagnosis. And I'll never forget the dad's hands just twisting, and the mother is just blank. And what a horrible diagnosis to make. So I told them I'll see them back after Christmas, and we'll talk about what to do next. So we brought her back, and she didn't die. In fact, she started gaining weight, and she got bigger and bigger, and she developed normally. She was now 8, 9 months of age, and the mother and we didn't ever want to talk about it. It's like we didn't, really. Every time we go, she's developing normally. She's gained weight. See you guys in a month. And it was like I had never given them this diagnosis. But finally, at about 9 months or so, Mrs. Headland says to me, what gives? I mean, you told me that she had Wolman's disease, and she's obviously thriving. So this came out of this is while I was doing my near-death research. And I had already heard these astonishing stories. So I told Mrs. Headland, I said, there's a lot about medicine that we don't understand. And there's a spiritual aspect to this that maybe that's what's going on here. I don't know. But it's certainly, I can't explain it from a medical viewpoint. So this is what happened. She went back to her family and she said, Dr. Morse thinks that this is a spiritual miracle, which I actually didn't say. But anyway, so they started talking about this in their family. And Mrs. Headland, they have a brother who's like the bad sheep of the family. He lived a rough life. I mean, I don't know if he's still alive, but, I don't want to go into the details of his life. That wouldn't be courteous. But I just want the point is, as he said to me, he said, I have no idea why this happened to me because I'm a bad man and I don't believe in God. And he was sort of the outcast of the family. So here's his story. He says that Christmas Eve, he heard a voice. He was in bed going to sleep. And then a voice said, go see Taryn Headland. And he goes, what? Well, he didn't believe it was real. The voice said again, go see Taryn Headland. and put your hands on her belly. And he's like, okay, all right, I'll do it tomorrow. All right, I don't know what this is about, but all right, I'll do it. And the voice said, no, go tonight. You must go tonight. He didn't even tell his wife that this happened. He told her he's going out for a pack of cigarettes. Goes over to the Headlands, and they were all, just in shock. And they didn't really, they weren't, I mean, they've clearly have made up since then, but, at the time, it wasn't like they were close. And so they didn't really know why he was there. And he just sort of said, I'm going to go see Taryn. They said, fine. He went up to her crib and he put her hands on her belly, and a bright light shined. And he left. And he had no framework to put this in. So he didn't even mention it. It wasn't until Mrs. Headland started saying and asking around the family, hey, Dr. Morse thinks that something spiritual happened, which I really didn't say. But then he came forward and told this story. What are we to make of this story? It's so odd. And I think that's one of the hallmarks of spirituality. It's odd. It doesn't make sense. It defies what we think spirituality is. I mean, nothing about it makes sense. I mean, why was it him? Why did he have to put her hands on her belly? Why did, and it was, so that's the story of Taryn Headland. And this is why I'm so passionate about the science of spirituality. Because I then went, the Dennis Christie was her gastroenterologist. And he's not, I think, like many high level physicians, he was a brusque man, uh, not a touchy feely guy at all. And I told him, I said, so what's the deal with Darren Headland? And he said, I don't know. He said, I can't explain it. But here's what he said, Gary and Sally. He said to me, but this stuff happens. He said it happens all the time. I was like, Gary, I mean, Dennis, what? This stuff happens all the time? He said, yeah, every once in a while, something just gets away from us. We can't explain it. I don't know.
Yeah,
Think
that's
about it.
amazing. It's
Think about
amazing.
That's
that
the
these
best
things,
Christmas story I've heard
yeah.
this
But
year.
Dennis Christie tells us that this happens all the time. He's not writing that up for the medical literature.
No.
He's not even telling other physicians. There's a whole level of reality that we are not understanding. And we have to start integrating with mediums, with psychics, with the spiritual people. We have to develop a common vocabulary, and we have to start understanding that each of us has something to give. Because the science of the near death experience and the science of the spirituality clearly indicates that these types of experiences are real.
Mhm.
Neuroscience 101 today is that we don't perceive this reality, we create it.
Mhm.
We create it. So, what is the experience we're having now? We have biological sensors, eyes, ears, etc., that sample the electromagnetic field that we are all embedded in. And it is a timeless, spaceless electromagnetic field. We sample it, the perceptions that we get are translated into bioelectrical signals, which go to our brain, and then our brain creates this reality. Even colors do not exist in nature. And we have to start teaching the science because that doesn't, when people hear that, that doesn't resonate with them. What? Colors aren't even real. They're not. And you can, a PBS series on the brain goes over all this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Um, but so we create this reality. In the Taran Headland case, if you read modern physics, is completely understandable given modern physics. It's sort of a Schrodinger's cat thought experience in real life that we don't really know what's going on. And so we can create our perception. And maybe that's why it had to be the black sheep of this family, because the Headlands had already been told that Taryn had this fatal diagnosis.
Right.
He didn't know anything about it.
Right.
So, so someone comes in who doesn't already, it hasn't actualized, it hasn't materialized. But physics tells us that that's what this reality is. That as soon as we don't observe something, it goes into a state of probability.
Mhm.
And then when we observe it again, it's actually even slightly different. They
Mhm.
can actually show it's a different size. Uh, a billionth of a millionth of a millimeter, but nevertheless, even the so-called solid objects around us are changing all the time. And so our belief systems dictate what this reality is. And I'd like to tell you another quick story because the reason I'm sharing this with you is I know your listeners have heard about near death experiences and mediumship, etc. But there's another layer to this that I think has to be blended in. So, and this is the science I'm going to tell you now.
Okay.
Because remember, I told you that the science says that we don't know what reality is until we observe it, until we name it, until we define it. Until then, it's in a state of probability. So there's some state of probability that, it's 1 in a billionth chance that Taryn Headland is going to spontaneously heal her own genetic disease. And that is somehow linked to spiritual experiences. So I'm going to tell you another one. I had a
Please.
patient the mother was pregnant. They received a diagnosis that their baby had no brain uh, as a fetus, had no brain, anencephaly. Again, diagnosed at the University of Washington with the most sophisticated ultrasound, equipment, and no one is going to give a diagnosis like that unless they're certain of it. So the baby was born and had a brain, and they came into my office for the visit. I was a pediatrician, so I wasn't aware of the events before, the obstetrician and all. Um, so I said to them, "Well, it says here that your baby doesn't have a brain, and obviously your baby does. I mean, so what's going on?" They looked at me, mother and father alike. They said, "Yeah, could you believe that? Those doctors up at the University of Washington actually told us that our baby didn't have a brain." I mean, how absurd, how stupid they were. I mean, they call themselves doctors. I mean, obviously, our baby had a brain, and their baby did. We don't know yet how to harness this spiritual aspect. They had spiritual experiences which had reassured them that their baby had a brain. Um, but, again, when I see these things debated in the medical literature, in the Facebook, etc., it seems that people are saying that science is against spirituality.
So,
That is not the case. But we're not paying attention. This kind of case must be more common than we think.
yeah.
And we have to start thinking about it.
And something I think is really important to bring out at this point is attitude, intention has everything to do with what we are creating. And we all know people who are always constantly negative. and they get repeat negative experiences because of that's the energy that they are putting out, and that's what's coming back to them. So guard your thoughts, and even if you don't like someone, you can still love them because we're all connected. We don't have to agree with them. We don't even have to be around them if, we don't want to be, but you still love them. And that's a hard leap for many to make, but it's so important
And
because
again,
the quality of our life changes when we change that thinking process.
so not your listeners. I'm sure your listeners are like totally like, yeah, right on. But most people that we would say that to, unfortunately, would go, oh, what a bunch of, new age BS. Come on. No, what you just said, Gary, is neuroscience 101. I had a career. I believe that I was in some way destined for this type of research because I studied under the great Dr. Montcastle and I studied under Candace Pert. She's a neuroscientist who documented just what you said. Every time you have a negative thought, you shower your body with negative neuropeptides, which actually damage, alter your brain's inner model, and actually cause subtle damage, of course. I mean, nobody's keeling over and dying from having one bad thought, but nevertheless, Candace Purse documented that this does occur, that our brain is in constant communication with every aspect of our body. And interestingly enough, our heart has neurons, has brain cells in it. That we're in communication with. So, we have to start accepting this when we start, and we have to start understanding how it happens. Because unfortunately, you know, once we have set our intention, we said, oh my God, our baby has no brain, then we've actualized it. We've made it like the physicists say, it's a Schrodinger's cat experiment. Once we open up the box, and then whatever we see is what's real. But you have to be someone like my patient who just absolutely did not believe it from the get go. But they're deeply religious people and their spiritual intuitions played a part in this. But unfortunately, I don't think that someone can just say, oh, well, I'm going to just, make my baby have a brain now. Um, you know, but there is things that we can learn and do, uh, much more than we're doing right now. We have to end this ridiculous science spirituality debate. It is the science of the 19th century arguing with the spirituality of the 17th century. And it's got to go. Um, they, I don't have any trouble working with physicists and neuroscientists, but I'll get to our mediumship study that we received the Bigelow grant to do. We have to start, even though these scientists know what I'm saying is right. And when I did my near death research, my fellow doctors would call me up in the middle of the night and discuss their spiritual experiences, etc. But not one of the three neuroscientists that worked with me on the Bigelow project, including a Harvard trained neuroscientist, not one of them would put their name on the paper. They said that is absolute, professional suicide. That's what I wanted to start to break down.
Well, and that's what I love about your work, Dr. Morse, is that you have actively worked to bridge the medicine, the science with the experiences that people have had. And they are spiritual in nature. I will absolutely agree with you on that. But I would claim they're all human. I think a lot of scientists are very concerned about being connected to the paranormal, right?
Right.
Because for them, that's woo woo. But in reality, it's just science we haven't gotten to yet.
Yeah.
Ex- I want to hug you through Zoom.
And
Right.
there's so much we don't understand. And because I think these physical bodies are a filtering system, the brain is a filtering system. So
Right.
everything gets stepped down. And in 3D reality, that dimension doesn't fit. I mean, it does fit, but psychologically, we can't wrap our minds around it because we're coming from a 3D perspective, linear time frame.
So I'm so amazed at what you're saying. So let me translate what you just said into scientific terms.
Thank you.
Perfect.
Okay. The current, well, I mean, we're in a paradigm shift now, but the current paradigm that is generally accepted is what's called bottom up causation for consciousness. That the little tiny molecules, somehow, in the primordial soup, lightning hit or something, little tiny molecules. Then they got bigger. They clustered into, you know, single cell organisms. They got more complex. And finally, we got the humans, and we have, the biggest brains of all. So we must be the only ones that are conscious, and that our brains create consciousness. So what you just described is what we call top down causation, meaning that there is a unifying force that comes through us, our brain being then a filtering system. Like I said, the color red. Our brain creates the color red out of the various electromagnetic impulses which come to us. And consciousness is a top down, so everything is then conscious in this light of, this way of looking at it. And guess who believes this? The world's smartest scientist, a guy named Robert Lanza. Um, he worked with Harvard when he was 13 years old on changing the genetics of a chicken that he did in his garage or something. I mean, that's close to the real story. But I mean, he is, Dr. Lanza's well, he's easily regarded as the world's smartest scientist, and he wrote about that, 20 years ago. Really, just putting what you just said, creating it in scientific terms. And oddly enough, it's gotten a lot of pushback from the scientific community. That sort of dinged him a little bit. All right, here's what happened to me. I did this study of near-death experiences in children. Frankly, we had thought that it was going to be anesthetic agents that caused a phenomena called dissociation, and that these patients were just dissociating because they were given various drugs, etc. Well, our study, we studied all survivors of cardiac arrest, and then we carefully compared them to control patients, patients who are given the same drugs, had the same lack of oxygen, same psychological stresses, were in the scary intensive care unit. Parents thought they were going to die. So the idea that, this just comes out of, the sort of a cultural, reflection of what it's like to die. But they weren't near death by our criteria. Our criteria was, that these were patients, had a 1 in 1,000 chance of living. When your heart stops beating, that's actually really bad. Unlike what you see on Grey's Anatomy, most patients, or children at least, when their heart stops beating, they don't recover. You always try to design a scientific study that no matter what your results are, you're going to be happy with them. And so, even though this didn't fit what we thought we were going to get, we realized that the near death experience is, in fact, the dying experience. So, I'm going to just share one story with you real quick. Um, this is a young man. His name is Chris Eggleston, and at 8 years old, his parents were ski instructors in the Seattle area, and they were coming home from teaching up on the slopes, down coming down the Cascade Mountains, and it was snowing, and the roads were icy, and they came around a bend and flipped over a guardrail and into the water, the river below. It's amazing how they were rescued. There was a guy behind them who was using their taillights to see where the road was. And suddenly their taillights disappeared. So I don't know if I would have done this. I don't know if most people would have done this. I mean, there's something about all this that fits together, in a way that it's not just coincidence. One of my professors used to say, coincidence is the refuge of the lazy mind. And there's a lot of lazy minds in this field because it's challenging the old paradigm. Um, so this guy, I mean, he must be one in a million people because he said, huh, where'd those lights go? So he stopped his car and got out in the driving snow and walked to and looked over and saw the car down there. He didn't just sort of assume, I don't know, that they pulled over or something like that. I kept driving, and he called us, and we were there, I don't know, within 45 minutes, and Chris was resuscitated. Chris's experience is great. Again, why I want to share my experiences, because when you actually hear these experiences, you know they're real. Because I talked to Chris about, our study, by the way, we didn't ask them whether they had a near-death experience. We were limited in what we could ask them, open-ended questions. What do you remember about being in the intensive care unit? So Chris says to me, "Oh, do you mean when I was in the huge noodle?" Like, well, tell me more about that. Oh no, it couldn't have been a noodle because noodles don't have rainbows in them. It must have been a tunnel. When someone says that to an 8-year-old boy, that he is not making this up from his preconceptions of what heaven is like, or making up a story to be on Oprah, or anything like that. The reason I'm sharing this with you is that after that, he never said that again. He always just said, I was in a tunnel. And because everybody, we know near-death experiences are in the tunnel, etc. But at his age, at age 8, he'd never even heard of a near-death experience. But Chris said this to me. He said, but was my experience real? Because if my experience was real, you've got to tell all the old people. And I took his comment very seriously. And I spent the rest of my career trying to establish whether these experiences are real or not. When Chris's mother heard this, she looked at me and she said, yes, I want to know too. Because if his experience is real, then mine is too. And here was her experience. Her experience was that when they were underwater, she was able to kick out the windshield of her car and swim to safety. And we were there we were sort of arriving at the time that she, emerged from the water. Blankets were put on her, and she was sitting on a rock, watching the resuscitation efforts, or trying to get the children out. There's 2 children. She looks over, and there's her husband, looking just as real as we are. So remember, our minds create this reality. So, that shouldn't surprise anyone. When she saw her husband, it wasn't like a ghost. He looked exactly real. And she looked over at him, and he said, everything is all right. This is exactly what is supposed to happen. And she looked at him and she said, "Are you kidding me?" She started screaming at him. She told me that she was swearing at him. Get off, get off your butt and get down there and help those people that are trying to rescue our sons. And she, you know, threw her arms at him and he disappeared.
Uh-huh.
And he, in fact, died in the car, as did the other child. So she had what, people would call an after-death communication or shared dying experience, etc. And I agree with her. We can study the near-death experience scientifically, but if the near-death experience is real, people are having perceptions of dead relatives and communicating with them, getting messages from them, then why aren't all these experiences real?
We recently had Kimberly Clark Sharp on, and I'm sure you know Kim. And I had met her 25 years ago at an IONS conference in Vancouver. She didn't remember me this many years later, but I remembered her. She said people always come up to her and say, "I want to have a near-death experience." She's like, "No, you don't."
Right.
Very hard on the body. There's so
Yeah.
much information out there. Just absorb what other people are saying. Just absorb that, and you get basically the same experience. And I heard one near-death experiencer say, dying sucks. Being dead is great, but dying sucks. So you don't really want to go through that.
Well, I want to come back to Kim's comment, but I was a resident when I worked for Airlift Northwest. And when I heard this experience and brought it back to Seattle Children's, and, I was thinking about, doing a study of it, everybody said, go see Kim Clark Sharp. Her husband, by the way, is a medic for Medic One in Seattle. So he's personally resuscitated numerous patients. So Kim Clark Sharp introduced me to the concept of near-death experiences, helped me in designing my study. And all of this is because she told me that she was with a patient once who nearly died, was resuscitated. And the patient said to her, "Well, if you don't believe me, there's a shoe outside the ledge of this window." And Kim climbs, sort of half climbs to look. And sure enough, there was a shoe.
She related the blue shoe story
Yeah.
in the interview. So I invite our listeners, if you haven't seen that one and this information fascinates you, to go back and watch that.
But again, showing how all these things are woven together.
Right.
You know, Dr. Montcastle told me what what a neurologist know, and Kim Clark Sharp, who's really, I think, one of the prime movers for ions. She introduced me to the whole concept, helped me with my study, etc. So the next thing that we did was we wanted to know what happens when you have a near-death experience. And so that's this book, Transformed by the Light. But we published all this in the scientific literature. So people who think, oh gosh, they're just making this stuff up. No, everything that we did, we first published in peer-reviewed scientific journals like the American Medical Association's pediatric journal. I mean, they're not publishing woo-woo stuff. We studied our children as they grew up, and we also studied adults who had near-death experiences as children. We had proper control groups, people who had near-death experiences, or people who nearly died but didn't have a near-death experience. I mean, maybe that causes the transformation, just coming close to death. Nobody listening to this needs to have a near-death experience, because I'm going to tell you the great secret of life that we learn from studying people who were transformed by their near-death experience.
Right.
And this is the great secret that you learn from having a near-death experience. Be nice. Love other people. Give to charity. We are we look at the tax returns of our study subjects, They gave more money to charity than any of our control groups. They most usually worked in the helping profession, social workers, doctors, and stuff like that. But that's the great secret. Understand that your life has meaning. You have to understand, I was 30 years old when I started my research in this and trained at Johns Hopkins. So intensive care unit doctors were pretty much bottom lined. We don't spend a lot of time thinking about stuff, other than, how to resuscitate patients. So, all right, so we did our transform study, and I interviewed one of our patients. Uh, this was 10 years later. And I said to him, okay, so what did you learn from your near death experience? He said, oh, I learned the meaning of life. I learned that my life is very important and is, so I'm like, oh, great. Now I'm going to hear that he's, cure for cancer. I mean, he's the chosen one. Or, I mean, that's what was going through my mind. And I don't feel bad about it because I think that's what goes through most people's mind when they hear somebody's been transformed by a spiritual experience. When this young man, he was in his 20s at this point, when he saw the look on my face, he said, no, it's not what you're thinking. I learned that my job is what is important. He said, I run a small remodeling company. I hired all my high school friends. Those numbnuts wouldn't have jobs if it weren't for me.
Huh.
And I learned from my near death experience that the meaning for my life was to run a small construction company. We had another guy tell us the same thing. I learned how important my life is. And I said, okay, I'll bite. What's important about your life? He said, I don't know. He said, maybe I'll never know. Maybe I'll walk out in the street and cause a car to stop so it doesn't hit me. And that'll set off a chain reaction that'll lead to something good happening. But what I do know is my life is important and it has meaning. So you don't have to have a near death experience to know that we're supposed to be nice, we're supposed to love each other, and that no matter what we do, our lives are important. Whether you're, a Hopkins trained, neuroscientist, or, whether you're, bookkeeper, whether you're a street cleaner, or whether you're a homeless bum, we're all the same. All our lives have the exact same meaning. So we did, though, document what you said, is that this relationship, this reality, as Dr. Lanza explained to us, is based on consciousness. That's it, that's what is the primal force. And so this reality can alter our physical reality. Physical reality is clearly based on the spiritual reality that is the underpinning of it. One of my favorite things about figuring out whether somebody had a near death experience or not is they'll tell me that watches won't work. I don't, this is, before iPhones and all. They'll say to me, I can never buy a watch that works because as soon as I wear them, they stop working. So and this kind of stuff is well documented, not just in our research, but Peter Fenwick, uh, studying the processes of dying, documented exactly the same thing. Because this so-called physical reality is actually something that we make up in our mind. And we all collectively decide what is this reality. That sounds kind of touchy-feely, doesn't it? Not at all.
Not at
Think
all.
about it. Think about it. When your child is age 2 or 3, don't you spend hours telling them what's red? That's red. That's red. That's red. That's red. But we don't do that with spiritual experiences. And so that's why there's so much confusion about it. That's why people go, wait a minute, how could a near death experience be real? Because one person said that they saw, a log, and another person saw a rainbow, and another person, well, because we don't have a common language anymore for spiritual experiences.
One of the other things that I have commonly noticed when listening to people talk about their near-death experiences is that they also then seem to open up to other more subtle experience. They become psychic, they become mediumistic, they become you just more aware. Have you found that to be true?
Sure. We documented that in our Transformed by the Light study. I worked. Actually, it is another book. I wasn't. I was an author on it. The Southwest uh, uh, re, sudden infant death research group, and I did a study in which we looked at that exact issue, and we found that people who had near-death experiences or spiritual experiences in general somehow had premonitions that their child would have sudden infant death. And we documented that prospectively. So, in other words, we didn't ask people what happened in the past, but rather we identified, a group of, 100 infants, and we followed those infants forward in time. And then, we saw that the ones that had their minds opened up, as you described, in fact, had premonitions. I mean, it's a tragic premonition, but not really. When I ask people the question of, was that horrible? They'll say, sure, of course it was horrible. But it taught me that my life has meaning, that my infant's death has meaning, that somehow there's some reason it happened. The problem with parents with grief, I've counseled too many parents that have lost children. And the problem is that life no longer has meaning for them. This, that a child would die before a parent, so their life has no more meaning, and they get into pathological grief. Premonitions can establish that sense of meaning, and that in itself can, as one person told me, it taught me that grief can lead to growth,
Yes.
which is something that most parents with have a child die. I mean, it's not unusual to never get over that.
Right.
So you're
Well, and I've
absolutely right.
had some direct experience with that myself, Dr. Morse, and I will say that it has led me to the understanding that while, yes, some of these events like near death experiences can lead to this expanded awareness, you can also place intention to expand your personal awareness. And you can do practices which will continue to open you. And so
Is
you
this
don't have
the
to nearly die.
Sally? Sally, this conversation, it sounds to me like it's been scripted because you said exactly what is the next thing I wanted to share with you. When I tried to answer Chris's question, is this real? The experience. The first thing is people who have near death experiences say they enter into a domain which they know everything, everything that ever was real, etc. Well, I can't do a study to see if God is real, or at least I couldn't think of one, but I learned about something called controlled remote viewing. And that was developed by the military of the United States. Interestingly, we developed it because the Soviet Union developed it first. So, so spiritual advances can come in very odd ways, but that is in fact why the United States developed controlled remote viewing. And controlled remote viewing is our own studies as well as numerous other studies published in Nature. So we're not talking about Guru Monthly. Nature is one of the most prestigious scientific journals. The initial studies on controlled remote viewing were published in Nature. So I wanted to learn to remote view. And I was fortunate that the military controlled remote viewers taught me to do it. And it expands your mind. It's one of those practices you're talking about. Because here's what controlled remote viewing is. If we want to use our mind to see something at a distance, how can we know how can I instruct you to see something at a distance without giving you a hint as to what it is? Or, I'll say, well, there's something in that forest over there. Well, you're going to already have ideas of what's in a forest. My brother wanted me to control remote view his wedding. So, I had to fight through the fact that I already had ideas of what would happen at a wedding. So the control remote viewers got around this problem by assigning a number to what needs to be visualized. So, whether they're looking for Saddam Hussein, which control remote viewers were instrumental in doing, or finding drug tunnels uh, from Mexico to here, they're presented with those. They have a manager who knows what the target is, and then the viewer just gets a number. 567-892-558. That's its psychic address. We're clusters of information, and so that's added to the cluster of information. And I'm telling you, Sally, or as well, Gary, I'm happy to teach either of you to remote view if you haven't done it already, because it is mind blowing.
I've played a little bit, and it is.
I constantly remember or think of the story. I think it was quoted in Victor Zamet's book that President Jimmy Carter gave a testimony that a remote viewer found a downed plane, the exact coordinates when nobody else could find it. And it was signed by Jimmy Carter that,
Yeah.
he had, experienced this.
The military controlled remote viewers, many of them are civilians, and they've all received, the highest awards from our government for their service. What you're talking about was they found a plane in Africa, and they were worried that the Soviet Union would find it before we did, and that's absolutely correct. It's a well documented story.
Yeah, it is amazing. And my one little dipping my toe into it was actually with the program that was done by Suzanne Giesemann. If you're familiar with her, she's a really well-known American psychic medium.
She
And
helped me with my mediumship study.
oh,
That's right.
fantastic. Yes.
Yeah.
Well, she had a picture in an envelope and had us all kind of, get into a state where we were receptive. And I saw what looked like stone ruins from above. I was calling it kind of a dilapidated castle type, that's kind of what the information I got. Well, it was a photo of Machu Picchu seen from above.
Exactly.
So
You've had that experience. So
yeah,
when you're given,
fun.
or I've never failed to be shocked by it. When I give, a series of 9 numbers that are linked, let's say, to the Eiffel Tower, and they start saying it's tall, it's rigid, there's people in it, it's in a city. But interestingly enough, then their own brain starts to fight them, and they'll go, oh, it must be the Space Needle. you know, and so then they'll start to hear, ferry boat sounds or something, and so it is a discipline, and it's a fairly rigorous discipline. Military control remote viewers can tell the difference between a church in France and a church in England.
Wow.
Amazing.
That's how good they are. I gave a lecture up in Montreal once. One of the students was given an assignment to remote view something, and she came up with a teddy bear, but it wasn't really. It was right next to what her assigned target was. So we thought that was great, and I was telling the military remote viewers about it. I was saying, "Wow! I mean, look how cool that was." She didn't exactly get the target, but she's pretty close. And they looked at me and they went, "Well, we call that a miss."
I wanted to interject.
Please.
You were talking about the person that said, "Was the experience real?" And this just kept knocking on my consciousness. So I want to put it out there. All the yogis, saints, whatever, have said the world's an illusion, but it's a very real experience. So every experience is real. The world may not be as solid and it may be a lot more fluid. And then you could bring in the idea of the Mandela effect, if you're familiar with that at all. Have you? Um, and
Yeah.
things change. I mean, I know things that certainly that's the way it was, but it wasn't, never was. There's a fluidity to the physical world. So,
Right. There's a fluid. So that's what we're talking about. When a baby that's documented to not have a brain, but the parents don't know it, suddenly has a brain.
right.
That's why my mom leaves me dimes. Uh, you know, she's passed. She's left me dimes, Gary, in places that there are no dimes,
Oh,
no
yeah.
dimes allowed. And my mom has left me dimes there. Um, so, but once again, let me translate what you've just said into scientific terms. David Eagleman, who the PBS series I was talking about, he has any number of YouTube dialogues between him and yogis, in which they find a commonality, because the neuroscience says that we create this world, and the yogis say this world is an illusion. Even when we talk about the color red, your color red might be different than mine for all we know. It's just we've mutually decided to what it is.
Kim Clark Sharp has said was the colors were so different during her near-death experience. She said a field of green wasn't green, it was green.
Yeah.
In other words, it was far more than she could even describe. And she so many times had a hard time finding the words to describe her experience. I mean, and she would state that as she went through,
Right.
because it's ineffable. It's
Yeah.
it's beyond the human experience. So
But that they're able to describe colors that don't exist in this reality.
right.
David Eagleman, in his book, points out, Live Wired is his book, points out that we should only be able to describe colors which we have actually seen, that so that's a huge piece of evidence that they're seeing the electromagnetic reality, which is the real. Uh, you know, like the kids say to me, it was real, Dr. Morse. It was realer than real. Anyway, so are these experiences real? Well, certainly we've learned from remote viewing that there is a domain which is timeless, spaceless, because we can remote view in the past. They try to remote view in the future. Let's not get into that I'll come back and talk to you about that. Certainly we can remote view in the past. In space, we can remote view around the world. Ingo Swann, who developed the concept of controlled remote viewing, he said, "Why are you giving me these targets? I'll tell you what are the moons around Jupiter." And the Voyager space probe proved that he was correct. These were moons that had not been described as yet. So that part of the near-death experience is real, and that we can enter into that domain. Like you were saying earlier, Sally, that people sort of, is that really true? And we can intent and all this. And sure, we know from control remote viewing that it's possible. Why wouldn't there be many other protocols for entering into that reality? And that reality holds all the information in the world. Well, guess what, Gary? We're clusters of information embedded in the electromagnetic reality. So when people say to me, mediumship must be bogus, we're clusters of information. Information is eternal. Of course, we live after we die. Why wouldn't we? The information that is us doesn't die with us, and that's what you were talking about earlier. It's because it's conscious, it's a top down process that the body is, as The gurus tell us we just go through body after body after body after body, brain after brain after brain. And why? Well, you don't have to have a near-death experience to know why. We're here to learn lessons of love. All of us are. They're pretty complex lessons. I mean, you have to learn a lesson from a child dying. You have to learn a lesson from being a murderer. I mean, these are brutal lessons. There's no question about it. This reality is not for sissies. Uh,
No,
the idea that it's all new age foo woo woo stuff
it's not.
is wrong.
Yeah.
So that brings me to the study that I did for Mr. Bigelow. Mr. Bigelow put out a call. He wanted to ask mediums. He had 4 questions about reality. He basically wanted to update a scientist named Allan Kardec's work in the mid 1800s, who was a scientist who interviewed mediums to ask them about the nature of reality. Why we're here, why there's war. And basically, Mr. Bigelow's questions, he had 4 questions, but they basically say the world seems like it's going down the tubes. There's just violence and strife everywhere. Have we failed as humans? Has the spirit world failed us? And what is the reason? How does the spirit world help us? What exactly does the spirit world, what's their responsibility? And are there earthbound spirits? So those are basically the kind of questions. And are these bad humans or earthbound spirits sabotaging us? Or, exactly what is going on? Well, I thought these questions were too loaded to ask. I mean, we know it's hard enough to say, could you tell me, could you describe a building in New York City for me? And already then your brain starts filling in, what we think it should be. Or I told you that even if you get a target right, like the Eiffel Tower, before you know it, your own ego is saying, no, it's not the Eiffel Tower, it's the Space Needle. And I know that's true because now I'm hearing, that the brain starts inventing stuff. Now I'm hearing a tugboat. So for sure I'm right because the ego wants to be right. So I took these questions and I turned them into numbers. And I have to tell you, Gary and Sally, that even we thought that this wouldn't work. And even Mr. Bigelow and his staff were very skeptical that we could pull this off. Because basically, we went to mediums, who are used to, could you help me to contact my, dead relatives? Or, we had the top shelf mediums. One of our medium works for the FBI for 27 years. So she's the real deal. And the FBI, since we wanted to publicize our work, gave her permission to state that she has solved over 400 cold cases, brought closure to families. And not just cold cases, has actively solved cases, that save children's lives. So, but she's used to, getting, here's, help me to contact a dead relative, help me to, here's a child's, here's her room. Is there something in there that can help us to figure out where she is? And instead, I said to her, oh, so we have a question for you. It's 597-698-325. What do you have to say to that? And they answered. One of the mediums, she contacted her entity, which was the all that is one. She says, "Well, I have a question for you," and the entity said, "Okay, we're prepared to answer it." She says, "Well, I don't know what the question is. I just know these numbers." And the entity said, "But we do." Because think about it. if they're really contacting a discarnate spirit, that is of the highest level, that, is, not just a spirit guide or, something like that, but is, that, well, five of our mediums contacted the I am that's the I am. That's one of the oldest spiritual entities we know. Well, then these spiritual entities know what the questions are. In fact, we came to understand that these spiritual entities inspired Mr. Bigelow. He put $1 million into it, and he funded 6 groups around the world to do this study. To answer Chris Eggleston's question, are these experiences real? Well, we've shown that they're the dying experience. We've shown that they're not caused by the brain, lack of oxygen, drugs, etc. But it seems to be that when the brain dies, think about it. The first thing that happens when the brain dies in a near-death experience is they fall into blackness. Well, that must be the sensation of sensory input. And now a new reality. Okay, we showed that. We showed through controlled remote viewing that this domain has all the information in it that ever was and ever will be. And we know that we're clusters of information. Michael Sherman, the so-called skeptic, he's ridiculous. He likes to debate Deepak Chopra. And they have one of these, to me, absurd debates because it's, again, the science of, the old science and the old philosophies. But Michael Sherman did say that we as human beings are clusters of information. So if that's true, which Michael Sherman, who writes for Scientific American, says is true, then we're all eternal. And then we showed through our mediumship study that we can, in fact, communicate with discarnate entities. And that's what the people who had near-death experiences told us that they did. One of my kids, she saw her dead grandmother when she had her near-death experience. She looks at me and she goes, "I was just so shocked to see her." That's how you know it's a real experience. So clearly, the science tells us that mediumship is real, that controlled remote viewing is real. It really, the science validates everything that you have told us, Gary, so far, in which you're saying that this physical reality is very plastic, can be altered, and that shouldn't surprise anyone because this clearly is a constructed reality for us to learn our lessons of love. That's all there is to it.
Right.
We have to believe that this is real.
Yeah.
And yet, as Buddhism, which is very close to modern neuroscience, by the way, as they tell us that there are then people who transcend this physical reality and that they can help us in learning our lessons of love. And I believe that that's happened to me. I believe that my own journey has been specifically designed for me to learn specific lessons of love, specific to me, that frankly, most people can't understand. And as it should be.
2 quick questions or 2
Please.
quick things. Explain to people who Mr. Bigelow is. Isn't he in aeronautics or?
Mr. Bigelow is one of the unsung heroes of, I don't know, spirituality or I guess of the anomalous phenomenon. I guess that'd be the best way to look at it. He's a Las Vegas billionaire, aerospace entrepreneur, works with NASA. So again, I mean, people's, well, I think that people do it deliberately, where they sort of dismiss and trivialize and distort the credentials of people who are doing this kind of research. Because Mr. Bigelow, he's an aerospace entrepreneur. There are space stations around this Earth right now that he's put up there, working with NASA. So they're not working with people who are flakes. They're only working with the highest level scientists.
Yeah.
He's a man who can talk to senators. He can talk to cosmologists. He heard about UFOs in Utah. So he bought the ranch and hired the highest level cosmologists, veterinarians to study this cattle mutilations. I mean, really just, people somehow say, oh, that these bright lights in the sky are just the movement of the stars that people are misunderstanding. Well, so he went and hired the highest astronomers, astrophysicists, to see if that was true. Um, so he documented that something's going on at this ranch. I personally think it's a spiritual experience that's going on there. But I mean, it's an open question as to what exactly it is.
Isn't that called Skinwalker Ranch or?
That's the Skinwalker Ranch.
Yeah,
Oh,
Skinwalker. There are some for people interested. There are some shows I believe on Amazon or Netflix about Skinwalker Ranch and some of the phenomena there.
yeah.
So you can watch that. Now, the other question I had was you did publish a book about this study that you did. Could you tell
Yes.
us the title of the book and where people can find it?
Okay. So our book is called An Urgent Message for Humanity. We wrote a report for Mr. Bigelow, which he published on his website, but we felt that this was too important, just be one of many studies that never is really publicized. Um, so we wanted people to be able to read this book, and you can go to our website, which is www.issscusa.org. We have, a link to the Amazon page that you can read our book, buy it. All the money goes for our research. But if you don't feel like buying our book, you can download our report. Our book is really our commentary on our report. We not only go over the scientific rigor that we used in investigating these mediums. We had a forensic psychiatrist investigate our mediums. We had an attorney listen to the various, interviews because, people are always saying, well, you sort of telescoped to the mediums what you wanted to hear, and there's cold readings and, all this kind of stuff. Or they were reading your face, so they knew what you wanted. Well, so that's why that's what attorneys do is, they know how to ask questions and make sure that there's an authenticity to the answers.
I think what you did with the numbering instead of a question was absolute genius. It lent so
Thank
much
you.
credibility to your report. I think that that was just absolute genius to switch it from asking the medium a question
Yeah.
to here's your number.
We learned from the mediums the answers to Mr. Bigelow's questions. Um, Basically, it's emphasizing that this reality is here to learn lessons of love. And there is no winning or losing. Spiritual progress has to be measured by the individual, that wars are often the engine of spiritual progress.
Sure.
We learned astonishing things. Listen to this one, and this is all, validated. Our mediums who did not know what the questions were. So one of the mediums, I think it was the FBI agent, she said, the second question was, tell us exactly what the spirit world has done for humanity. Give us precise examples that would stand up in a court of law. And so the medium says to us, all I'm getting is a picture in my mind. I said, so draw it. And she drew 6 round circles connected by lines. And that's the benzene ring. And the benzene ring was, in fact, given to a German chemist named Kukule through a spiritual vision. And he was very open about this. This transformed him. He said, we must dream, believe our dreams, and then take them to the laboratory. Because the other thing that the medium said is, I'm seeing red threads. So she herself has no, understanding what this is. And before she was an FBI agent, she worked as an elementary school teacher. So she's not a chemist or, knows these kinds of things. Kukule then developed aniline dyes. And this was the birth of the German industrial might, because these dyes were used in clothing, in fabrics, which made them a tremendous amount of money. And the first dye that was developed was a red dye. Well, Germany then, their industrial might led directly to World War I, which led directly to the League of Nations. And that's what our mediums were trying to tell us. That you think, you think that the World War I is horrible. Well, sure it is. But on the other hand, it led directly to the League of Nations. I even pressed him on this, Gary and Sally. I said, so you're telling me that Gaza, the horrors of Gaza, is part of our spiritual reality? And they said, nobody dies.
Right.
So why are you so worried about it? Of course, there's enormous suffering. You guys, suffering is part of your lessons of love, both to inflict it and to suffer.
I've often said my biggest growth happens through my hardest times, suffering or whatever. That's when I grow the most.
Everything you've said is really sort of the spiritual shadow of the science that I've been trying to understand. I just want to say one more thing about my book that I'm really proud of. Okay, so the book is an urgent message for humanity. You can get it on Amazon. But I worked with forensic psychiatrists. I told you 3 neuroscientists who refused to be named, professor of music, because we believe that there's certain rhythms and patterns of reality that unite us all. And he's a professor emeritus at the University of Asheville, or University of North Carolina in Asheville. And we put together our theory of how exactly mediumship works, an actual theory that people can then develop testable hypotheses. And we invite anybody to read, any scientist, to read our theory and try to shoot us down. First of all, because in the process of trying to show us why we're wrong, we'll learn more about why we're right. But in the several months that our book's been out, we've only heard one. No kidding. Somebody has finally put this all together. We're only getting an aha from our fellow scientists. Other than, actually enough, people who say, wait a minute, science doesn't believe in this stuff. I say, so what scientists are those? Well, I don't know, but I know scientists, or scientists that know nothing about neuroscience or know nothing about near-death research. Scientists who have just a passing knowledge of this, have never read the research, have never looked at the studies, but they just know because they're invested in the old paradigm. So they
Right.
know that this can't be true.
And we
So
need more generalists that can take all these expertise from all these different fields to put them together in ways that haven't been done yet. And then we lose the
Thank you
dogma
so
of the
much.
science.
So just to put in a hook, Gary, so you will actually invite me back.
Yes, absolutely.
Absolutely. I can't
What
wait to
we have
talk about
shown,
this.
we have shown that there are rhythms that underlie this reality. And this comes out of the physical sciences. And this is why our music professor is involved, because they're called 1 over F uh, rhythms. And that's just a mathematical term. But these rhythms are found everywhere that they've looked. The movement of electrons, magnetic fields, and in human behavior. So the movement of cars on the freeway have the same frequencies as the movement of electrons in a hunk of metal, in the movement of water, uh, the dripping of a faucet, internet traffic, and the movement of the neurons in our brains. Our brains don't are not well, they're chaotic, but chaos mathematics tells us that there's patterns hidden in it. And these same rhythms are in the patterns of how our brain actually works. When they measure a neuron, it moves, it's excited. But the pattern of it is this 1 over F pattern. And this 1 over F pattern is what's found on the quantum level, which has been seen by other scientists at the University of Arizona as being the link between us and quantum reality. And as a physician, when these patterns are disrupted, people have gait disorders, people have autism, people have seizure disorders, so there's a clinical significance to them as well. The professor that we work with, who would prefer that our name not be mentioned, actually developed music based on 1 over F patterns, which he has documented to show improvement in autistic patients. So I would love to come back and talk to you about the glue, the spiritual glue that is holding us all together. Mathematics is the Holy Spirit.
You're my kind of nerd, Dr. Morse. I can't wait to have you back again. But thank you so much for this fascinating conversation. Obviously, we've only scratched the surface, but we
Thank you
really
so much for
appreciate your
inviting me.
willingness.
This is one of the best interviews. I love to just tell the children's stories. I do.
Yeah.
There's nothing I would love better than to sit for, an hour with grieving parents and tell story after story after story. As an intellectual, I want to go beyond just telling the stories.
Right. So in all of these experiences that you've had and the studies that you've done and the research, has your fear of death dissipated?
Absolutely. I
Yeah.
have no fear of death.
Me,
I'm
me
afraid my wife is going to die. I was raised in the Jewish religion, and people might find this funny, but you don't have to believe in God to be Jewish.
right.
And my parents didn't. My our take on Judaism was a very cultural one. I was not, so I did not have any kind of religious background. I've really come to the understanding you're asking me about through my scientific explorations, and I have no doubt that when my wife dies, if she dies before me, that she'll be waiting for me. And that's an enormous comfort. And I think for people, I work I work with criminals, uh, the ex-incarcerated, etc. And it's extremely uh, comforting for them to know that no matter what they've done, which can be a barrier to them, most people don't really like to be in prison and be a bad person. But then you get into a state where you're addicted to drugs. You've already done so many bad things that you see no way forward. To learn, though, that maybe it'll be the next lifetime that you'll process these lessons of love. And, and these have all come to me through my scientific process. Anybody hearing this, there's no reason to fear death. And you can know that you're all going to get a big hug from God. An attaboy, you're going to get that hug of unconditional love. Remember, unconditional love is unconditional. That's why Nazi prison guards get it as well as saints. There's nothing to be feared.
Dr. Morse, thanks so much for being with us today. We've thoroughly enjoyed this. This has made my week. And we definitely will have you back. We have so much to discuss. And I think we're on the same wavelength, maybe coming at it from slightly different perspective, but it's the same thing. It's the same thing.
Exactly.
So
Exactly. I
thank
have
you.
so much to learn from you, and I hope I have things to share with you
All right.
that
Well,
will,
thank you.
we'll move the ball down the field.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll see you again.
Thanks so much.
You bet.
All right.
If you enjoyed this content, please hit like, subscribe, and ring the bell for notifications.